"He's a predator," the prosecutor's voice boomed, echoing off the courtroom walls. But he wasn't talking about the uniformed officer smirking at the prosecution table. He was talking about Malik Carter, a 17-year-old astrophysics nerd whose only crime was walking home while black. Officer Brian Keller, the man who had fabricated the evidence, watched with triumphant satisfaction. He had framed a boy for a crime he didn't commit, and now he was watching the final act of his twisted play. He caught Malik's eye and gave a slow, deliberate wink, a shared secret of corruption between the liar and his victim. In that moment of silent, smug confession, a fire ignited in Malik's chest. The officer had stolen his freedom with a lie, but that wink was an act of war that was about to explode. Malik Carter wasn't supposed to be here. His world was meant to be one of cosmic dust and stellar nurseries, of gravitational waves and the elegant, silent dance of distant galaxies. He was a boy who read astrophysics textbooks for fun, who could trace the constellations with his eyes closed, and whose dreams were painted on the vast, dark canvas of the universe. His bedroom walls weren't covered with posters of athletes or musicians, but with high-resolution images from the Hubble telescope. A worn copy of Carl Sagan's Cosmos lay on his nightstand, its pages softened by the countless times his fingers had traced the words. He had a full scholarship to his dream university waiting for him, a golden ticket out of the gritty inner-city neighborhood that had been both his home and his cage. That future had evaporated 3 months ago, on a Tuesday night that now felt like a lifetime away. He'd been walking home from the library, his backpack heavy with books on quantum mechanics, his mind buzzing with theories about dark matter. He took a shortcut through a park, a route he'd taken 100 times before. But on that night, the familiar shadows held a new menace. A squad car had screeched to a halt beside him, its lights painting the trees in strobing flashes of red and blue. Officer Brian Keller had emerged from the car, his face a mask of instant suspicion. "Where you headed in such a hurry, kid?" Keller's voice was gravelly, laced with an assumption of guilt that Malik had felt in his bones. Before Malik could even answer, he was being slammed against the hood of the car, the cold metal a shocking contrast to the warmth of the evening. The books on quantum mechanics had spilled onto the asphalt, their pages fluttering in the breeze like wounded birds. Keller's search was rough, invasive, a violation that went far beyond the physical. He found nothing, of course. No drugs, no weapons. Just a library card, a student ID, and a half-eaten chocolate bar. But Keller hadn't been looking for evidence. He'd been looking for a narrative, a story that fit the one he'd already written in his head. A local convenience store had been robbed an hour earlier. The suspect was described as a young black male in a hoodie. That was all Keller needed. The fact that Malik was 6 inches taller than the description, wearing a university sweatshirt, not a hoodie, and carrying a backpack full of science books, was an inconvenient detail that Keller simply chose to ignore. He'd found a small, empty plastic baggie in Malik's pocket, the kind that had held the nuts and bolts for a telescope he'd been building. For Keller, it was a smoking gun. "Drug paraphernalia," he'd declared, his voice triumphant. The arrest was swift, brutal, and humiliating. Malik's protests were met with a knee in his back and the cold, metallic click of handcuffs. Now, sitting in the courtroom, the memory of that night was a fresh wound. He looked at his mother, Angela, in the front row. She was a rock, a fortress of love and support, but he could see the cracks in her facade. Her face, usually so full of life and laughter, was etched with lines of worry. She worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment afloat, her hands calloused from years of hard labor. She had poured every ounce of her being into giving him a future that was now being stolen from them by a man who saw her son not as a scholar, but as a statistic. The absence of his father was a dull, familiar ache. He had left when Malik was 6, a phantom presence in his life, a man he knew only through faded photographs and his mother's carefully chosen stories. Angela had always said he was on important business, a vague explanation that Malik had stopped questioning years ago. He had learned to live with the emptiness, to fill the void with science and the steady, unwavering love of his mother. The public defender, Mr. Allen, patted his shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt like a final, gentle push towards the abyss. "Just stay calm, son," Mr. Allen whispered, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "Let the system do its work." But Malik knew the system wasn't working. It was a machine, and he was just another cog being ground to dust. He looked back at Keller, who was now whispering something to the prosecutor, a shared joke at Malik's expense. The smirk was still there, a cruel, unwavering testament to the power he wielded. And in that moment, Malik felt a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. A cold, hard, defiant anger. He would not be a statistic. He would not be a ghost in a stale courtroom. He was Malik Carter, and he belonged to the stars. And he would not let this man, this small, hateful man, tear him from his sky. The world of Officer Brian Keller was built on a foundation of cracked concrete and rusted rebar, a landscape of perceived slights and festering resentments. To understand the man, you had to go back 20 years to a cramped, smoke-filled apartment that always smelled of stale beer and regret. His father, a decorated but deeply bitter police captain, had ruled their home with the same iron fist he'd used on the streets. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, good guys and bad guys, us and them. And them was always, unequivocally, the people who lived in the parts of the city he was paid to patrol, not protect. Keller had grown up on a steady diet of his father's cynicism. He'd learned at the dinner table that respect was something you took, not earned, and that fear was a more effective tool than trust. He'd seen his father come home night after night, his uniform a little more stained, his spirit a little more corroded, spinning tales of the animals he had to deal with, the scum that was dragging the city down. The narrative was simple, seductive, and absolute. It was a legacy of prejudice, passed down from father to son like a tarnished family heirloom. The defining moment of Keller's life, the event that had poured concrete into the foundation of his hate, came when he was 19. His father was killed during a botched raid, shot by a suspect who was later identified as a young black man. The nuance of the situation, the faulty intelligence, the poorly planned raid, the fact that the suspect was a scared kid who had fired in a panic, was lost on Keller. All he saw was the confirmation of his father's every warning. The world was a dangerous place, and the danger had a specific face. He'd joined the force a year later, not out of a sense of civic duty, but out of a desire for vengeance. He wanted to wear the uniform, to feel the weight of the gun on his hip, to wield the power that he believed was his birthright. He saw himself as a soldier in a war, a thin blue line against the chaos. But over the years, the line had blurred. He had become the chaos, a predator who stalked the very streets he had sworn to protect. His brand of policing was a dark art. He was a master of the pretextual stop, the illegal search, the subtle intimidation that could escalate a simple conversation into a confrontation. He knew how to write a report that would justify any action, how to plant the seed of doubt in the mind of a prosecutor, how to turn a victim into a suspect. He was a cancer in the department, but he was also effective. He made arrests, closed cases, and kept his record clean enough to avoid any serious repercussions. His superiors saw him as a bulldog, a necessary evil in a city that was always on the edge. The arrest of Malik Carter had been, for Keller, just another Tuesday. He'd seen a kid in a park at night, and his mind had filled in the rest. The boy's intelligence, his politeness, his talk of stars and galaxies, it had all been a performance, a clever act to hide the guilt that Keller was sure was there. In his world, a boy like Malik didn't dream of the cosmos. He dreamed of street corners and quick scores. To believe otherwise would be to question the very foundation of his worldview, and that was something Keller was incapable of doing. He sat in the courtroom, a pillar of righteous conviction. He watched Malik and his mother, Angela, and felt a familiar sense of contempt. He saw her as a failure, a woman who had raised a thug, and he saw Malik as a threat, a weed that needed to be pulled before it could spread. The slap he had delivered in his mind, the mouthed insult, was a small, satisfying release of the pressure that was always building inside him. It was a reassertion of his dominance, a reminder of who was in control. He felt no guilt, no remorse. Guilt was a luxury for the weak, and remorse was a confession of error. In his mind, he had made no error. He was simply doing his job, cleaning up the streets, one punk at a time. He was his father's son, and he was making him proud. He was the hero of his own story, a story in which Malik Carter was destined to be the villain. And as he prepared to take the stand, he savored the thought of delivering the final, damning lines of his testimony, the words that would send the boy to a cage and prove, once and for all, that he had been right all along. The prosecutor, a man named Henderson with a sharp suit and the predatory smile of a shark, began to paint his masterpiece of deception. He moved around the courtroom with a practiced theatrical grace, his voice a carefully modulated instrument of persuasion. He held up the small, empty plastic baggie as if it were a shard of pure evil, a totem of the vast criminal enterprise he was about to invent. "This," Henderson declared, his voice echoing in the silent room, "is a vessel of poison, a delivery system for the narcotics that are tearing our communities apart." Malik felt a wave of nausea. He looked at the baggie, the one that had held the M4 bolts for his telescope's primary mirror mount, and felt a surreal sense of detachment, as if he were watching a play about someone else's life. Henderson called his first witness, Officer Brian Keller. Keller walked to the stand with a confident, almost arrogant stride. He settled into the chair, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the jury. His face was a mask of solemn duty, his voice calm and authoritative. He was a master performer, and this was his stage. He recounted the events of that night with a chilling, detailed precision. But it was a work of fiction, a story in which every fact was twisted, every detail reimagined to fit his narrative. He described Malik as shifty and evasive. He claimed Malik had been loitering in the park, a known hotspot for drug activity. He said Malik had resisted arrest, that he had been belligerent and disrespectful. "When I approached the suspect," Keller said, his voice resonating with false sincerity, "he immediately became agitated. He was looking around, as if for an escape route. His body language was aggressive. I had to use physical force to subdue him." Malik's hands clenched into fists under the table. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to leap to his feet and call him a liar. But he was trapped, a fly in a spider's web, and every move he made only seemed to entangle him further. He looked at his mother. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in a silent prayer. He could feel her pain as if it were his own, a physical weight pressing down on his chest. She had always taught him to be proud, to hold his head high, to never let anyone make him feel small. And now, in this courtroom, he felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Mr. Allen, his public defender, began his cross-examination. But it was like watching a man trying to punch his way through a brick wall. Keller had an answer for everything. He was a fortress of lies, and Mr. Allen's questions were like pebbles thrown against its walls. Officer Keller, Mr. Allen began, his voice thin and reedy compared to Henderson's booming baritone. Isn't it true that my client is a student at Northwood High, an honor roll student with a full scholarship to the state university? I wouldn't know about that, Keller replied, his tone dismissive. All I know is what I saw that night. And what you saw was a young man with a backpack full of science books, correct? I saw a suspect in a high-crime area, acting suspiciously. The contents of his backpack were irrelevant to my initial assessment of the threat. A threat? What threat did he pose, officer? Keller paused, his eyes narrowing. The threat of the unknown. In my line of work, you learn to trust your gut. And my gut told me that this kid was trouble. It was a masterful performance of deflection and innuendo. Keller was painting a picture of a dangerous, unpredictable world where a police officer's gut feeling was more valuable than a young man's entire life, his dreams, his future. The day wore on. A slow, agonizing crawl towards a predetermined conclusion. Malik felt his hope, once a bright, burning star, begin to flicker and fade. He was trapped in a story that was not his own. A story written by a man who hated him for reasons he couldn't comprehend. As the court recessed for a short break, Malik looked at his mother. She came to the railing that separated the gallery from the defendants, her eyes red-rimmed but her gaze steady. "I love you, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't you let him break you. You are not what he says you are. You are my son. You are a child of the universe. Don't you ever forget that." Her words were a lifeline, a thin thread of light in the suffocating darkness. He held on to them as he was led back to his seat, a mantra of defiance in the face of a lie that was threatening to become his truth. The weight of that lie was crushing, but the weight of his mother's love was a force of nature, a gravitational pull that kept him from floating away into the abyss. He would not break. He would not forget who he was. He was Malik Carter, and his story was not over yet. The moment came for Malik to take the stand. As he walked past the prosecution's table, he could feel Keller's eyes on him, a physical pressure on the back of his neck. He sat in the witness chair, the wood cool and solid beneath his trembling hands. He looked out at the courtroom, at the jury's impassive faces, at his mother's anxious gaze, at the flag hanging limp and lifeless behind the judge's bench. Mr. Allen began his questions, his voice gentle, coaxing. He asked Malik about his life, his school, his passion for astrophysics. As Malik spoke, his voice, at first a hesitant whisper, grew stronger. He talked about the beauty of the cosmos, the thrill of discovery, the way looking at the stars made him feel both infinitesimally small and infinitely connected to everything. "I'm not a criminal," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity. "I'm a student, a son. I was just walking home, that's all." He told his version of that night, the truth, plain and unadorned. He spoke of the shock, the fear, the humiliation. He didn't embellish, he didn't exaggerate. He simply laid the facts bare, a stark contrast to the elaborate fiction that Keller had woven. Then it was Henderson's turn. The prosecutor rose, a predator sensing weakness. He circled the witness stand, his questions sharp and pointed, designed to trip him up, to make him look foolish, to twist his words into a confession. "You say you were coming from the library, Mr. Carter," Henderson began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A little late for a school night, wasn't it?" "I was studying for an exam," Malik replied, his voice steady. "Or maybe you were meeting someone? Conducting a little business in the park?" "No, sir, I was just walking home." Henderson picked up the plastic baggie again, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. "And this? You expect the jury to believe this was for a telescope?" "Yes, it held the bolts for the mirror mount." Henderson laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "A likely story, a very creative story. But that's all it is, isn't it, Mr. Carter? A story." The questions came faster now, a relentless barrage of accusations and innuendo. Henderson was painting him as a liar, a cunning manipulator who was using his intelligence to deceive the court. Malik felt his composure beginning to crack. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, a hot, bitter tide. From his seat, Keller watched with a smug, satisfied grin. He leaned over and muttered something to the officer beside him, a low, guttural sound that Malik couldn't quite hear, but he could feel its venomous intent. Henderson's final question was a masterstroke of cruelty. "Mr. Carter, you ask this court to believe that a decorated officer like Brian Keller, a man who has dedicated his life to protecting this city, would simply invent a reason to arrest you. Why would he do that? Why would he single you out?" Malik looked from Henderson's sneering face to Keller's smirking one. And in that moment, the truth, raw and unfiltered, erupted from him. "Because he didn't see a student," Malik said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and pain. "He didn't see a kid walking home from the library. He just saw a black face in a park at night, and that was all the evidence he needed." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Henderson looked momentarily stunned. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening. "That's enough, Mr. Carter," the judge warned. But the dam had broken. From his seat, Keller shot to his feet, his face a mask of rage. "You little punk," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You don't get to talk to me like that." "Officer Keller, sit down," the judge commanded, his voice booming through the courtroom. But Keller was beyond reason. He was a man consumed by his own hate, a pressure cooker that had just exploded. He took 2 long strides towards the witness stand, his hand raised. Time seemed to slow down. Malik saw the blur of the uniform, the glint of the overhead lights on Keller's badge, the raw, unadulterated fury in his eyes. He saw his mother rising to her feet, her mouth open in a silent scream. He saw Mr. Allen, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. And then came the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, definitive, a sound that cut through the stunned silence of the courtroom like a gunshot. It was the sound of a hand on a face. The slap sent a jolt of pain through Malik's cheek, but it was the shock that took his breath away. He stumbled back in the witness chair, his hand flying to his face, his eyes wide with disbelief. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge was on his feet, banging his gavel, his face a furious shade of red. Bailiffs surged forward, their hands on their weapons. Angela's scream, no longer silent, tore through the air, a raw, primal sound of a mother's anguish. And in the center of it all stood Officer Brian Keller, his chest heaving, his hand still tingling from the impact. On his face was not a look of regret, but one of triumphant satisfaction. He had finally put the boy in his place. He had won. But as the courtroom doors at the back of the room swung open with a sudden, forceful thrust, Keller's victory was about to be short-lived. A new player had just entered the game, and the rules were about to change forever. The chaos in Courtroom 3B was a symphony of discord. The judge's gavel was a frantic, percussive beat against the rising swell of shouted objections, a woman's heartbroken sobs, and the urgent commands of the bailiffs who were now struggling to restrain a snarling, defiant Officer Brian Keller. The air, once stale and oppressive, was now electric with shock and outrage. And then, through the pandemonium came a new sound, the heavy, deliberate swing of the courtroom's main doors. All eyes, as if pulled by an invisible string, turned towards the entrance. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright light of the hallway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a perfectly tailored gray suit that seemed to absorb the chaos around him, rendering it silent and still. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the scene with a calm, analytical precision that was unnervingly out of place. He didn't look at the judge, or the jury, or the weeping woman in the front row. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, landed first on the disheveled figure of Officer Brian Keller, then moved to the witness stand, where a stunned and trembling Malik Carter was still cradling his face. The man's presence was a physical force, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that commanded attention. The shouting subsided into murmurs, the murmurs into whispers, and the whispers into a profound, echoing silence. Even the judge, his gavel still raised, seemed to be holding his breath. He walked into the courtroom, his footsteps measured and silent on the worn linoleum floor. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet confidence that spoke of immense, untapped power. He was not a lawyer, not a cop, not a court official. He was something else entirely. As he approached the front of the courtroom, he unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing the subtle but unmistakable glint of a federal badge clipped to his belt. He walked past the prosecution's table, past the public defenders, and came to a stop in the open space before the judge's bench, placing himself directly between Keller and Malik. He turned his head slightly, and for the first time, looked directly at Malik. It was a look that held a universe of emotion, regret, pain, and a fierce, protective love that was as undeniable as a force of nature. In that instant, Malik's world tilted on its axis. The face, older now, etched with lines of stress and exhaustion that hadn't been there in the faded photographs, was one he knew better than his own. It was his father. Angela let out a small, choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Thomas," she whispered, the name a fragile, forgotten prayer on her lips. The man, Thomas Carter, gave his son a barely perceptible nod, a silent promise that the nightmare was over. Then he turned his attention to the judge, his expression now cool, professional, and utterly implacable. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and clear, filling the silent room with an authority that was absolute. "My name is Thomas Carter. I apologize for the interruption." The judge, a man accustomed to being the sole authority in his courtroom, seemed at a loss for words. "And who, exactly, are you, Mr. Carter?" he finally managed, his voice a mixture of confusion and irritation. Thomas's eyes flickered towards Officer Brian Keller, who was now being held firmly by two bailiffs, his face a mask of disbelief and a dawning, sickening realization. "I'm the person," Thomas said, his voice dropping a degree, becoming as cold and hard as steel, "who is about to ruin this officer's life." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a leather credential case, flipping it open with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Special Agent in Charge Thomas Carter," he announced, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Officer Brian Keller is now the primary subject of a federal inquiry into civil rights violations, corruption, and perjury." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor, Henderson, looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Mr. Allen's jaw was on the floor, and Officer Brian Keller's face, once so full of smug satisfaction, had gone completely, deathly pale. The hero of his own story had just come face to face with a plot twist he had never seen coming. The man he had just assaulted, the boy he had dismissed as a worthless punk, was the son of one of the most powerful men in federal law enforcement. The game was over, and he had just lost in the most spectacular way imaginable. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a living entity, heavy and suffocating. Special Agent in Charge Thomas Carter stood as the calm epicenter of the storm he had unleashed, his presence a stark, immovable object against which the flimsy foundations of the prosecution's case were about to shatter. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice a low, controlled current of energy that crackled in the still air. "The United States Department of Justice has had an open investigation into the 14th Precinct for the last 18 months. Officer Brian Keller has been a person of interest for the last 6. He gestured to the courtroom doors, which swung open again to admit 2 more figures, a man and a woman, both dressed in the same sharp, functional attire of federal agents. They moved with a silent, synchronized efficiency, flanking Thomas like sentinels. "We have reason to believe," Thomas continued, his eyes locking onto the prosecutor, Henderson, "that Officer Brian Keller has engaged in a pattern of racially motivated harassment, illegal searches, and the falsification of official reports. A pattern that has led to numerous wrongful arrests, including that of my son." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then turned his gaze to Keller, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of the scrutiny. "Officer Keller," Thomas said, his voice devoid of any emotion save for a cold, clinical precision. "You testified under oath that you had a gut feeling about Malik Carter. Let's talk about your gut. Is it the same gut that told you to pull over a Hispanic family last month and search their car without a warrant, claiming you smelled marijuana when your own body cam audio recorded you telling your partner you were bored?" Keller's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The blood had drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. "Is it the same gut," Thomas pressed on, his voice relentless, "that prompted you to falsify a report 2 months ago, claiming a young Asian woman had assaulted you when video evidence from a nearby ATM clearly showed you were the aggressor?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Or perhaps it's the gut that led you just last week to plant a controlled substance on a homeless man who had filed a complaint against you for excessive force." With a nod from Thomas, the female agent stepped forward and handed a thick file to the stunned court clerk. "This contains sworn affidavits, surveillance transcripts, and financial records, Your Honor. It paints a very clear picture of a police officer who uses his badge not as a shield to protect the innocent, but as a weapon to terrorize the vulnerable." He then turned back to Keller. "You testified that Malik resisted arrest, but your own patrol car's dashcam, which you conveniently forgot to mention in your report, shows my son being fully compliant, even as you slammed his head against the hood of your vehicle. You testified that he was in a high-crime area, yet the park he was in has the lowest crime rate in the entire district. You testified that the plastic baggie in his pocket was drug paraphernalia, yet you failed to mention that he had the receipt for the telescope parts he had just purchased in his wallet, a receipt you took from him and disposed of before booking him." Each statement was a hammer blow, dismantling Keller's carefully constructed fortress of lies brick by brick. The prosecutor, Henderson, was frantically shuffling through his papers, his face a mixture of panic and fury. He had been played, used as a pawn in Keller's hateful game, and his career was now caught in the blast radius. "And then there's today," Thomas said, his voice finally allowing a sliver of the raw, paternal anger he had been holding in check. "Today, you committed assault, in a federal courthouse, against a witness. That's a federal offense, officer, one that carries a mandatory prison sentence." He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on a foundation of perjury and fabricated evidence. It is a sham. I ask that you declare a mistrial and dismiss all charges against Malik Carter immediately." He then looked at the 2 bailiffs who were still holding Keller's arms. "And I am now placing Officer Brian Keller under arrest on behalf of the Federal Bureau of Investigation for assault, perjury, and obstruction of justice. He will be remanded to federal custody." The 2 federal agents who had entered with Thomas stepped forward, produced a pair of handcuffs, and took Keller from the stunned bailiffs. The click of the cuffs as they locked around Keller's wrists was the final, definitive sound in the unraveling of his world. The smug smirk was gone, replaced by a look of utter, abject terror. The bully had been stripped of his power, his uniform now nothing more than a costume, his authority a phantom. He was just a man, a small, hateful man, who had finally been forced to face the consequences of his own darkness as he was led away, his life in ruins. He was no longer the hero of his own story. He was just another criminal, his name now a permanent stain on the badge he had so thoroughly disgraced. The courtroom, once a theater of high drama, was now a scene of quiet, stunned aftermath. The judge, looking shell-shocked, had declared a mistrial and dismissed all charges against Malik without prejudice. The jury was let out, their faces a mixture of confusion and relief. The prosecutor, Henderson, was packing his briefcase with the frantic energy of a man fleeing a burning building. Malik was a free man. But he didn't feel free. He felt hollowed out, a vessel scoured clean by trauma. He was still sitting in the witness chair when his mother reached him, wrapping him in a fierce, trembling hug that was both an anchor and a shield. He buried his face in her shoulder, the familiar scent of her perfume a small, comforting island in a sea of chaos. And then he saw his father. Thomas was standing a few feet away, his suit jacket now buttoned, his professional mask firmly back in place. But his eyes, when they met Malik's, were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that Malik had never seen before. It was a look of profound regret, of years of unspoken words and unbridgeable distance. The reunion was not the joyful, tearful embrace of a Hollywood movie. It was tense, awkward, weighted down by a decade of absence. They were led to a small, private conference room, a sterile, windowless box that felt more like an interrogation room than a place for a family to heal. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence was thick with questions that had no easy answers. Finally, it was Angela who broke it. "Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you have a lot of explaining to do." Thomas nodded, his shoulders slumping with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. He looked at Malik, his gaze unflinching. "I know," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "I know I do. And I know that 'I'm sorry' isn't enough. It will never be enough." He told them about his life, a life lived in the shadows, a world away from the quiet, domestic existence he had once shared with them. He was part of a deep-cover unit that infiltrated domestic terrorism cells, a job so dangerous that it required him to sever all ties to his past, to become a ghost. "When I left," he explained, his voice heavy with the weight of his choices, "it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. But we knew, your mother and I, that it was the only way to keep you safe. The people I was investigating, they were monsters. If they had ever found out about you, they would have used you to get to me. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't." He had an agreement with Angela. He would stay away, a phantom in their lives, until his work was done. He had a contact, a trusted friend in the justice system, who kept an eye on them from a distance, a silent guardian angel. "When you were arrested," Thomas continued, his eyes fixed on Malik, "my contact flagged it. It crossed my desk because it was connected to the investigation into Keller's precinct. At first I couldn't believe it. Of all the corrupt cops in this city, it had to be the one who arrested my son." He had wanted to intervene immediately, to use his power to crush the charges before they ever saw the light of day. But his superiors had insisted he wait. Keller was the linchpin of their investigation, and they needed to catch him in the act, to expose the entire network of corruption. "They told me to let the system play out," Thomas said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "They promised me you would be exonerated, but I never, in my worst nightmares, imagined it would go this far. I never imagined he would put his hands on you." He had been monitoring the trial from a remote location, watching every moment, every lie, every sneer. When he saw Keller rise from his seat, he knew he could wait no longer. He had broken every protocol, risked his career, and driven to the courthouse himself, a father's love overriding a federal agent's duty. Malik listened, his mind reeling. The phantom father, the man he had resented for his absence, had been a protector all along. A silent knight in a war he had never known was being fought. The anger and resentment he had harbored for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a confusing mix of relief, gratitude, and a deep, aching sadness for the years they had lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" Malik asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to," Thomas said, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Every single day, but I couldn't. It was the price of keeping you safe." There were no easy resolutions, no magic words that could erase the pain of the past. The road ahead for them would be long and difficult, a journey of rediscovery and forgiveness. But in that small, sterile room, a single, fragile seed of hope had been planted. As they left the courthouse, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, they saw a news van pulling up, a swarm of reporters descending on the scene. In the distance, a police car was pulling away, and through the back window, Malik could just make out the defeated, broken figure of Brian Keller, a man whose world had been built on a foundation of hate, a foundation that had now crumbled to dust. The long road home had just begun, but for the first time in a long time, Malik felt like he was finally walking in the right direction. 6 months later, the world was a different place. The chill of the courtroom had been replaced by the crisp autumn air of a university campus, the oppressive silence by the buzz of intellectual curiosity. Malik stood on the roof of the physics building, his hands resting on the cool metal body of a powerful telescope, its lens pointed towards the heavens. The trial had been a media sensation, a story of corruption and redemption that had captivated the city. Officer Brian Keller had been convicted on all federal charges, his name now a byword for police brutality. The investigation into the 14th precinct had led to a dozen more arrests, a cleansing fire that had swept through the department. But for Malik, the victory had been a hollow one. The scars of his ordeal were not visible, but he felt them every day. A sudden siren, a passing police car, the way a stranger looked at him for a moment too long. It was all it took to bring the fear and anger rushing back. The universe, once a source of boundless wonder, now felt distant, its beauty obscured by the ugliness of what he had endured. His scholarship had been reinstated, his future restored. But he felt like a fraud, a boy playing the part of a student, his mind still trapped in the four walls of that courtroom. His relationship with his father was a work in progress, a series of tentative steps across a chasm of lost time. Thomas had taken a leave of absence from the FBI, his focus now on rebuilding the family he had been forced to leave behind. They had dinner together every Tuesday, a quiet ritual of reconnection. They talked about everything and nothing, about sports, about movies, about the latest discoveries in astrophysics, but they rarely talked about the trial. It was a wound that was still too raw to touch. Tonight was different. Thomas had joined him on the observatory roof, the city lights a glittering tapestry below them. For a long time, they stood in a comfortable silence, two men bound by blood and a shared trauma, looking up at the same sky. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Malik said, his voice quiet. "It is," Thomas replied. "It's easy to forget, with everything that happens down here, that all of that is still up there." Malik nodded, his gaze fixed on the faint, ethereal glow of the Orion Nebula. "I almost lost it," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He almost took it from me. Not just the scholarship, not just my future. He almost took the stars." Thomas was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Men like Keller," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "They feed on fear and hate. They want to shrink your world, to make you feel as small and as powerless as they feel inside. They want to pull you down into the darkness with them, so you can't see the light anymore." He put a hand on Malik's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "The fact that you are standing here tonight, looking at the stars, that's not just a victory, son. It's a revolution. It's a testament to the fact that they can't win. They can break your heart, they can scar your soul, but they can't take the universe from you. Not unless you let them." In that moment, something shifted inside Malik. It was as if a cloud had lifted, a weight had been removed from his soul. He looked at his father, at the man who had walked through fire to save him, and he saw not just a federal agent, but a man who understood the universe in his own way, a universe of good and evil, of light and darkness, of the quiet, relentless struggle for justice. The world is full of men like Brian Keller, men who build their worlds on foundations of hate and fear. They are a force of gravity, constantly trying to pull us down, to crush our spirits, to extinguish our dreams. They may hold power, they may wear uniforms, they may even have the force of law behind them, but their power is an illusion, a fragile construct that shatters in the face of courage and truth. True strength isn't about the power you wield over others. It's not about the authority of a badge or the force of a fist. It's about the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to hold on to your dreams when the world tries to tear them from your grasp. It's about looking up at the vast, beautiful, indifferent universe and finding your place in it, not as a victim, but as an explorer. The scars of injustice may never fully fade. They become a part of us, a reminder of the battles we have fought and the lessons we have learned. But they do not have to define us. They do not have to be the lens through which we see the world. For every act of hate, there is a counter-response of love. For every lie, there is a truth waiting to be told. And for every soul that is lost in the darkness, there is another that is reaching for the stars. The fight for justice is not won in a single dramatic courtroom showdown. It is won in the quiet, everyday acts of courage, of kindness, of refusing to let the darkness win. It is won by continuing to look up, to dream, and to remember that we are all, in the end, children of the universe. And the universe is, and always will be, on the side of light.